I can trace the collapse of my entire family to a single black laboratory notebook that my father kept hidden in his sock drawer. It was unremarkable, unassuming, a cheap college-ruled composition book with a cracked spine and pages so yellowed they looked like parchment, the kind of thing you would toss into a recycling bin without a second thought. The cover was blank, no label, no title, just a faint water stain in the shape of a ghost. On the very last leaf, in my father's increasingly shaky but unmistakably careful handwriting, was a short, chilling message that read, "Maggie, do not trust Alan. Check the custodial account at First Regional. I believe he is stealing. He brought papers and made me sign. I am so sorry, I love you." Dad, that notebook, that sentence scrawled in fading blue ink by a dying man whose mind was being slowly hollowed out by dementia, would become the fuse on a powder keg of evidence that exploded my brother's entire existence. My brother, Dr. Alan Bryce, a respected board-certified neurologist with a thriving private practice in Seattle, would end up stripped of his medical license, convicted of federal fraud, and forced to sell his practice and his home to satisfy a civil judgment of over $500,000. The notebook set off a chain of events that landed him in a federal penitentiary, left his picture-perfect life in ashes, and taught me the most brutal lesson about trust that I have ever learned. And believe me, when you hear the details, you will understand exactly why I never hesitated for a second. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family should never weaponize trust for personal gain. My name is Margaret Bryce, though everyone who knows me calls me Maggie. I am 51 years old, and I spent the better part of 3 decades working as a medical billing compliance auditor for a large hospital network in the Pacific Northwest, a job that trained me to see fraud in places most people would never think to look. I started as a file clerk at 19, fresh out of high school, working the night shift in a basement records room where I pushed carts of manila folders between rows of dented metal shelves. There were no windows down there, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper and dust, and I would spend 8 hours a night pulling charts for the next day's appointments, filing discharge summaries, and dreaming of something bigger. I had no money for college, but I was hungry, so I signed up for night classes at the local community college, first a medical terminology course, then anatomy, then a certificate in medical coding. I would get off my shift at 6 in the morning, sleep until noon, study for a few hours, and then go back to the hospital by 11 at night. It was exhausting, but I loved the puzzle of it, the way a human body could be reduced to a string of 5-digit codes, and yet each code told a story. By the time I was 30, I was a certified professional coder with a specialization in Medicare and Medicaid fraud detection, and I had a reputation around the hospital as the kind of auditor who could find a billing discrepancy in a stack of 500 charts faster than anyone else. I could read a remittance advice like a second language, could spot upcoding, unbundling, phantom billing, kickback schemes, and the subtle art of manipulating evaluation and management codes from a mile away. My job was to make sure that every CPT code, every HCPCS modifier, every diagnosis pointer, every single piece of documentation lined up perfectly with the service rendered before a claim went out to an insurance carrier. And if it didn't, I was the one who flagged it, wrote the audit findings, and sent it back to the provider for correction. I once found a podiatrist who had been billing for full foot amputations on patients who clearly still had all 10 toes. And I once caught a psychiatrist who was systematically billing 40-minute therapy sessions as 90-minute intensive psychotherapy with medical evaluation, a difference of nearly $1,000 per session. I loved the work. It was quiet, meticulous, deeply satisfying, the intellectual equivalent of untangling a massive knot of fishing line. And I thought, in all those years, I had seen every flavor of healthcare fraud imaginable. But I never expected, not for a single moment, that I would one day use those skills to dismantle my own brother's life. My father, Robert Bryce, raised my brother Alan and me alone after our mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 11 and Alan was 14. He was a high school science teacher at a public school in Olympia, the kind of teacher who wore a different bow tie every day, kept a jar of pickled frogs in his classroom as a conversation starter, and spent his summers painting houses to make ends meet, often coming home with speckles of white latex in his hair and a tired smile that he insisted was genuine. He never remarried, never complained, never let us see the exhaustion that must have hollowed him out inside. He just poured every ounce of his energy into us, his 2 children, and he made sure we never felt the poverty that hovered at the edges of our lives. I remember him teaching me to balance a checkbook at the kitchen table, his large hands guiding mine over the columns of numbers, explaining the difference between a credit and a debit with the same patient enthusiasm he used to explain mitosis. He was a good man, a kind man, the sort of man who would spend his only free weekend fixing a neighbor's roof and refuse to take a cent for it. Alan was the golden child from day one, brilliant and handsome and effortlessly charismatic, the kind of kid who got a perfect SAT score without a single tutoring session, won the state science fair with a project on planarian regeneration, and sailed into a full scholarship at a top-tier pre-med program at the University of Washington. He was the one Dad would talk about at parent-teacher conferences with a light in his eyes. Everyone said he was destined for greatness, and he believed it. I was the other one, the steady one, the dependable one. The daughter who came home after school to make dinner while Dad graded papers, who balanced the checkbook at 15 because Dad always got the math wrong, who sat up with him through his occasional migraines holding a cold cloth to his forehead. I didn't resent the role, not really. We all have our parts to play, and I told myself that being the reliable foundation was honorable, even if it didn't come with applause. Alan, meanwhile, soared. He became a neurologist, specializing in movement disorders like Parkinson's and essential tremor, and he built a thriving private practice in a sleek medical building north of downtown Seattle. He married Vanessa, a former bank teller turned luxury real estate agent, a woman with sharp blonde angles, a perpetual tan, and a way of speaking about my simple life in hushed, pitying tones that made me grind my molars into dust. They bought a 5-bedroom house in a gated community in Bellevue, filled it with furniture that cost more than my annual salary, drove matching imported SUVs, and threw lavish holiday parties where I would stand in a corner holding a glass of cheap wine and feeling like an exhibit in a museum of someone else's life. I didn't care about their wealth. I had my own life, quiet and small but mine. I had my career, my small 1-bedroom condo near the hospital, my cat named Minerva who was fat and imperious, my bookshelves crammed with mystery novels and procedural thrillers. I visited Dad every Sunday without fail, drove the hour and a half down to Olympia, took him to his appointments, managed his retirement accounts, helped him downsize after his knee replacement, sorted his mail, fixed his leaky faucets, and just sat with him watching old black and white movies on a television that was older than I was. It was just what you did. Family. 6 years ago, when I was 45, my father was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia. The diagnosis came after a series of small strokes, transient ischemic attacks, that we didn't even recognize at first because the symptoms were so subtle. He would forget a word, misplace his keys, get briefly confused in a familiar grocery store. The neurologist, not Alan, a kind woman at the memory clinic, sat me down and showed me the MRI scans, the scattered bright spots of white matter damage that looked like tiny fireflies caught in a web of gray tissue. She explained that the condition was progressive and that my father would gradually lose the scaffolding of his memory, his executive function, his ability to recognize faces and places, until he could no longer care for himself. I sat in that cold exam room, staring at the images, and I felt the world tilt sideways. I knew immediately what it meant. I asked for a leave of absence from my job, cashed out a chunk of my 401k, and moved back into my childhood home in Olympia to become his full-time caregiver. My boss at the hospital thought I was insane. My colleagues threw me a goodbye party with a cake that said, "Don't forget us," in blue icing, which I found morbidly appropriate. Alan, when I called to tell him, just nodded over the phone and said, "That's probably for the best. You've always been better at the hands-on stuff. I'll handle the medical side." I should have seen the red flag in that sentence. I should have heard the quiet click of a trap setting, the sound of a door I was about to walk through blindfolded. But I was exhausted and scared, and I wanted so badly to believe that we were a team, that the golden child and the invisible daughter would finally stand shoulder to shoulder and protect the man who had given us everything. So I let him handle the medical side. That decision, that single moment of trust, would cost me nearly everything, and it would eventually cost him his freedom. The first year of caregiving was manageable, though already slowly grinding. Dad still knew who I was most days, still shuffled with me to the park down the street where we would sit on the bench overlooking the duck pond, and he would tell the same old stories about his teaching days, about the time a student's volcano experiment set off the fire alarm, about the boy who asked him if pickled frogs were edible. I cooked his meals, bland but nutritious, soft foods after his teeth started giving him trouble. I set up a meticulous spreadsheet to track his expenses, his medications, his appointments, his blood pressure readings, his sleep patterns. I arranged the living room so he couldn't trip over cords, installed grab bars in the bathroom, put a baby monitor in his room so I could hear if he tried to get up in the night. I learned to bathe him gently, to shampoo his thinning white hair without getting water in his eyes, to redirect him when he got agitated and thought I was a stranger. I would read to him from his favorite old science books, the ones with the dog-eared pages and the pen marks in the margins, and sometimes his eyes would flicker with recognition, and he would say, "That's a good one, Margaret." My full name. He only used it when he was fully present. It was work no one ever sees, the kind that leaves your back aching and your heart shredded and your social life a distant memory. But I did it without complaint because I loved him. Because I had promised myself a long time ago that I would never abandon him the way the world abandons its elderly. Financially, we were stable but tight. Years earlier, after he sold the old family house in Seattle, where we grew up, my father had placed about $400,000 into a custodial account at First Regional Bank, a joint account with me as co-owner and designated caregiver trustee. The account was specifically earmarked for his long-term care needs, home modifications, medical equipment, assisted living if it ever came to that. It was a careful, frugal sum, every dollar a result of his decades of painting houses and teaching and never buying anything new. I managed that account like a hawk, every penny accounted for, every withdrawal documented and justified. I kept a binder with printed statements and receipts, cross-referenced with the spreadsheet, and I balanced it to the cent every month. Alan knew about the account, of course, and he occasionally made noises about optimizing the investment strategy or diversifying the holdings, but I always deflected. The money was safe, insured, and accessible in a plain old savings account with a respectable interest rate. That was all that mattered. Then, about 3 years ago, my father had a sudden and terrifying decline. He started having more transient ischemic attacks, mini strokes that scrambled his cognition overnight, each one leaving a little less of him behind. He went from forgetful to confused, from confused to terrified. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming because he didn't know where he was. He stopped recognizing the house he had lived in for 30 years. He thought I was his sister, or his mother, or a nurse he had never met. He would stare at my face with blank, frightened eyes and ask me who I was, and I would have to gently remind him over and over that I was his daughter Maggie, and sometimes he would cry with relief and sometimes he would push me away. It was brutal. I was drowning in grief and exhaustion, sleeping in 2-hour snatches, forgetting to eat, losing weight I couldn't afford to lose. My hair started falling out in clumps from the stress. I remember one night, about 3 in the morning, I found him standing in the kitchen with a butter knife, convinced there was an intruder. I managed to calm him down, guided him back to bed, and then I sat on the floor of the hallway and wept until my chest hurt. And that was when Alan swooped in. He appeared on a Saturday morning, unannounced, though I later realized nothing he did was ever truly unannounced in his own mind. He wore a tailored navy blazer with gold buttons and carried a leather briefcase that smelled of expensive conditioner. Vanessa was with him, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her smile so tight it looked like it had been stapled on. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same scarred oak table where I had done my homework as a child, and Alan leaned forward with his elbows on the wood and his hands clasped in that practiced, empathetic doctor pose he had perfected. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and soothing, "I know this is hard. I can see how exhausted you are, and I'm worried about you. You're too close to it. You're emotionally compromised, and I mean that in the medical sense, not as a criticism. As a neurologist, I have a better understanding of what Dad needs right now, the clinical progression, the medication management, the long-term trajectory. I think it's time we revised his care plan and consolidated his legal affairs so there's no confusion going forward." He had documents already prepared, pulled from that briefcase with the crisp efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. Durable power of attorney for healthcare. Durable power of attorney for finances. A living will with a do not resuscitate clause. A HIPAA release authorization. He had even brought a notary public with him, a bored-looking woman named Gretchen Wilkes who waited in the car outside, scrolling through her phone. He explained that with the POAs in place, he could coordinate Dad's specialists, manage his medications, streamline the bills, handle the insurance reimbursements, and generally take the administrative burden off my shoulders. He said it would give me a chance to rest, to reclaim some fragment of my own life. He said, "I've done this for dozens of my patients, Maggie. It's standard. I'm just looking out for you and for Dad." I was sleep-deprived and emotionally shattered. I had been up for 3 nights straight because Dad kept trying to climb out of bed, and I was terrified he would fall and fracture a hip. My resistance was a puddle on the floor. I asked Alan, weakly, if the POA would affect the custodial account at First Regional, because that was the one thing I knew I had to protect. He laughed, a warm, dismissive little puff of air, and said, "Of course not. That's your money too, you're still co-owner. This is just for medical decisions and day-to-day expenses. The POA doesn't override your ownership rights. You'll always have control." He reached across the table and patted my hand. The gesture felt like a cold stone dropped on my wrist. But I didn't trust my own instincts anymore, so I let it pass. Dad was in a lucid window that afternoon, one of those fleeting moments when the fog parted and the man I knew emerged blinking into the light. He recognized Alan, lit up like the sun breaking through clouds, called him my boy with a tremble of joy in his voice. Alan took him into the living room, closed the door, and emerged about 40 minutes later with signed documents and a triumphant little smile that he tried to hide. My father had, in his diminished state, willingly granted his brilliant doctor son complete authority over every facet of his existence, medical, financial, legal. And I stood there in the kitchen and let it happen because I was too broken to argue, too trusting to see the glint of the knife. That, I later learned with absolute certainty, was the exact moment my brother began constructing the elaborate machinery that would eventually destroy his own life. And it was a machine built on the bones of our dying father. The POA gave Alan access to everything. He didn't waste a single day. Within a month, he had arranged for my father to be moved to a specialized care facility that he personally recommended, a place called Harborview Senior Residence in an expensive suburb north of Seattle, a sleek building with a chandelier in the lobby and a brochure that promised dignified memory care in a resort-like setting. It was a decent facility. I will grant that, clean and well-staffed, but the cost was $12,000 a month, which was double what I had been spending to care for him at home. I protested, said we couldn't afford it for more than a few years before the custodial account would be drained dry. Alan waved me off with a flick of his manicured fingers. "The custodial account will cover it, and I've got some new interventions that insurance will reimburse. There are telehealth codes, home visit codes, some new Medicare waivers. I can manage the cash flow. Relax, Maggie. Let me handle it." I was pushed to the sidelines. I could still visit Dad, and I did, almost every day, driving up from Olympia in my rusting Corolla, sitting with him in his small room with the view of the parking lot, holding his hand while he stared at the television without seeing it. But I was no longer the primary decision-maker. I couldn't talk to his doctors without Alan's approval. I couldn't move him. I couldn't even access his medical records without going through Alan's office. I was a visitor, not a daughter, and the facility staff treated me with a distant, polite condescension because my brother, the important neurologist, had painted me as the fragile, emotionally unstable sister who couldn't handle the pressure. The social worker at the facility, a thin woman with a perpetually worried expression, once pulled me aside and told me that Dr. Bryce had informed them that I suffered from anxiety disorder and cognitive fatigue, and that all care decisions should be routed through him. I was too stunned to respond. I just nodded and walked away. I stayed in the old house in Olympia because I had nowhere else to go, rattling around in the empty rooms, the silence pressing against my eardrums. The days stretched into an endless gray fog of worry and loneliness, and slowly, too slowly, I began to notice things that didn't add up. At first, the anomalies were just faint whispers in the back of my mind, things I rationalized away because the alternative was unthinkable. Alan would mention in passing, during our brief, tense phone calls, that he had done a home visit for Dad, a phrase that made no sense because Dad was in the facility and couldn't receive home visits. When I asked, he explained that under certain billing rules, a residential care facility could be coded as a home setting for evaluation and management services, which I knew was technically possible under some Medicare guidelines, but was vanishingly rare and required specific documentation. He said he needed to bill the custodial account for some cognitive assessments that weren't covered by insurance because they were considered family convenience codes. I once glimpsed a bank statement that had been left on the kitchen counter when I visited Alan's house for a tense, awkward dinner, and I saw a withdrawal line item for $4,200 to Bryce Neurology Associates LLC with a memo that said Neuro Eval, home setting, 3/15. I stared at that line for a long moment, feeling a cold prickle at the base of my skull. But I was so beaten down, so conditioned to trust my brother's authority, that I convinced myself it must be legitimate. He was the doctor. He had the white coat and the wall of diplomas. He knew what he was doing. I was just the tired, frazzled sister who couldn't understand the complexities of modern medical billing. That's what he wanted me to believe, and I let him. One afternoon, about 6 months before my father died, I was visiting him and happened to run into the facility's medical director, Dr. Susan Lafferty, a brisk, competent woman in her 60s. I asked her casually if my brother had been by recently to check on Dad. She gave me a strange look and said, "Dr. Bryce hasn't examined your father since the intake assessment a year ago. Our staff neurologist handles all routine neurological follow-ups. We don't allow outside physicians to bill for services performed here unless it's a specific specialist consultation, and even then it goes through our billing office." She said it kindly, but the words hit me like a splash of ice water. Alan had told me he was doing monthly home visits, ongoing cognitive assessments, even specialized nerve testing. The facility's medical director had just told me none of that was happening. I thanked her, my voice shaky, and I went home and stared at the ceiling for a long time. But I did nothing. I still couldn't bring myself to believe that my brother, my own flesh and blood, was systematically stealing from our dying father. I told myself there must be a misunderstanding, a paperwork error, a coding mix-up. I buried the sick feeling in my stomach under a layer of exhaustion and denial. That was my mistake, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. My father died last October. He was 78 years old, and he went quietly in his sleep at the facility, a merciful end after years of slow, terrible erosion. I was there, holding his hand, the same hand that had taught me to write my name and make a proper pancake flip. His fingers were thin and cool, the skin papery. I told him I loved him over and over, and at the very end, his fingers squeezed mine once, very faintly, a last pulse of recognition before his breathing stopped and the room became impossibly still. I sat there for a long time, crying silently, my forehead pressed to his knuckles. The staff gave me time, and eventually a nurse gently touched my shoulder and said she would call the funeral home. I nodded and walked out of that building like a ghost. Alan wasn't there. He was at a medical conference in Austin, a seminar on deep brain stimulation techniques that he later listed as a business expense. He sent a brief text message that read, "Sorry to hear. We'll handle arrangements. Don't worry." That was it. No call, no comfort. Just 5 cold words on a screen. The day after my father died, Alan and Vanessa arrived at the house in Olympia like a pair of corporate liquidators sent to dismantle a failing subsidiary. I was still in my pajamas, my eyes swollen and gritty, my hair an unwashed tangle, sitting on the edge of the couch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. They burst through the front door without knocking, carrying clipboards, empty banker's boxes, and a thick roll of packing tape. Vanessa immediately started pulling books off my father's shelves, stacking them into piles she labeled donate and trash without asking me anything. Alan opened drawers, rifled through filing cabinets, separating documents into piles marked estate and dispose. He kept saying things like, "We need to get this house on the market fast. The spring buying season is peaking. And Maggie, you won't have to lift a finger. Just sign a few things and let us handle the logistics." The efficiency felt obscene, a mockery of the grief that was still raw and bleeding inside me. I didn't have the energy to fight. I just watched them dismantle my father's life in fast forward, each object they tossed into a box feeling like another small death. At one point, Vanessa pulled open my father's sock drawer, the bottom one in his bedroom dresser, the one he had always used for personal mementos. She scooped out a handful of old photographs, a rosary that had belonged to my mother, a small velvet pouch containing my father's wedding ring, and a small black notebook with a faded, unmarked cover. She wrinkled her nose as if she had touched something contaminated and said, "This is all junk, just sentimental clutter. It goes." She dropped the entire handful into a black trash bag and tied the top with a sharp, efficient yank. Something in me flared then, not anger exactly, but a possessive, primal grief. That junk was my father's life, the fragments he had kept close to his skin. I waited until they moved into the kitchen to raid the pantry, and then I retrieved the trash bag from the bin in the hallway where they had tossed it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the knot. I fished out the notebook, noting the dampness from the bag's contents, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan before resealing the bag. I didn't look at it then. I just needed to hold onto something that was his. I returned that bag to the bin and stood there for a moment, pressing the notebook against my hip through the fabric, feeling the hard edge of the cover like a heartbeat against my leg. That night, after Alan and Vanessa had finally left with their boxes and their clipboards and their hollow promises to take care of everything, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by shadows and the faint smell of my father's old pipe tobacco that still clung to the walls. The house was so quiet I could hear the old refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. I pulled out the notebook and opened it on my lap, under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. It was a laboratory notebook, the kind with heavy paper and a stiff, cloth-bound cover, the pages grid ruled in pale blue. My father had used it for years to record observations, ideas, little notes to himself, the scattered detritus of a curious mind. The first few pages were mundane and oddly comforting, a list of bird sightings from 1984 that included a red-tailed hawk and a pair of cedar waxwings, a recipe for pickled beets written in his neat cursive, a diagram of a pulley system he had designed for a science fair project, a pressed 4-leaf clover taped to one page with yellowing cellophane. Then there were blank pages, dozens of them, as if he had set the notebook aside and forgotten it. I flipped through them slowly, feeling the texture of the paper, imagining him holding this same book, his fingers on these same pages. And then on the very last leaf, the paper thinner and softer than the rest, in my father's unmistakably shaky handwriting, the letters slanting and uneven but still legible, was a short message. It read, "Maggie, do not trust Alan. Check the custodial account at First Regional. I believe he is stealing. He brought papers and made me sign. I am so sorry. I love you, Dad." The world tilted. The room seemed to contract around me, the air thickening. I read the sentence 7 times, 8 times, 9 times, my hands trembling so hard the notebook shook like a living thing. My father had known. Even with his mind unraveling, even with the fog of vascular dementia closing in, my father had seen what I had been too blind, too trusting, too emotionally exhausted to see. He must have written this during one of those fleeting moments of clarity, a precious window when the real man surfaced and saw the truth. And he had left me a warning, a message in a bottle cast out into the darkness, hoping it would find me. It had. I pressed my palm flat against the page, as if I could feel his hand through the ink, and I wept until my throat was raw. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, the notebook open on my bedside table, the words glowing like embers. Grief was still a raw, open wound, but underneath it, something cold and hard was forming, a kernel of clarity and resolve that I had not felt in years. I replayed every interaction, every red flag I had ignored, every strange billing line I had rationalized away. The pieces began to click together with a sickening, mechanical precision. By the time the sun came up, pale and watery through the window, I had made a decision. I would not confront Alan directly. Not yet. I needed to understand exactly what he had done, and I needed proof, the kind of documentary, irrefutable proof that would stand up in a court of law, in front of a state medical board, in front of a federal prosecutor. I had spent my entire career catching fraudulent billing. I had the skills, the knowledge, the forensic instincts. It was time to turn that lens on my own flesh and blood. Alan and Vanessa, blissfully unaware that the ground was shifting beneath their feet, immediately began applying pressure to finalize what they called the estate settlement. They cornered me in the living room 2 mornings later, a spread of legal documents fanned out on the coffee table like a deck of cards arranged for a trick. The air in the room smelled of Vanessa's expensive perfume, something floral and cloying. Alan had his caring physician face on, his voice low and smooth as polished stone. "Maggie, there's a lot to deal with. Dad's estate, the house, the car, the accounts. We need to get everything consolidated so we can close probate cleanly and avoid any tax complications. I've had my attorney draw up a few documents to simplify things. Essentially, you'd sign over your co-ownership of the custodial account at First Regional to me as executor, and I'll handle distributing the remaining assets according to Dad's wishes. It simplifies everything. You won't have to worry about taxes or paperwork or any of that tedious stuff." Vanessa leaned forward, her smile sharp as a blade. "We just want to take care of you, honey. You've been through so much. You need rest, not stress. Let us handle the heavy lifting." The document on top of the stack was titled Release of Co-Ownership and Assignment of Interest. It had a notary stamp line already waiting, blank and patient. The legal language was dense, paragraph after paragraph of whereas and heretofore and indemnify, but the intent was brutally clear. I would be giving Alan complete, irrevocable control over every penny that remained in that custodial account, no questions asked, no accounting required. I would be signing away my claim, my rights, and my father's legacy. I remembered the notebook. I remembered the warning. I made a split-second decision to play a role, and I let my face go slack and confused, which wasn't hard given my genuine exhaustion. I said, "I don't know, Alan, this is a lot to process. All these papers, all these words. Can I take some time? I just need a few days to think, to clear my head. I'm still a little foggy from everything." His smile tightened a millimeter, barely perceptible, but I saw it. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. "Of course, Maggie, of course. But we're on a clock here. The bank has certain internal deadlines for estate resolution, and we don't want the account to go into some kind of probate limbo. Just don't wait too long. A few days is fine, but not weeks." I nodded meekly. I was playing a role now, the fragile, overwhelmed, slightly dim sister who couldn't handle complex legal matters. I had learned a long time ago in my career and in life that people underestimate you when you seem weak. They lower their guards, they say things they shouldn't, they leave doors unlocked. I was going to let them underestimate me into the ground, and I was going to gather every scrap of evidence while they did. They suggested, with that same cloying concern, that I move into their guest suite temporarily so I wouldn't be alone in that sad old house with all those memories. I agreed immediately, which surprised them. I could see the quick flicker of relief in Alan's eyes, the assumption that I was compliant, malleable, a problem that was solving itself. I packed a bag, a small rolling suitcase with my clothes, my laptop, my father's notebook, a few key financial files I had kept, and the small leather case containing my lock-picking tools that I had not touched in 20 years but had never been able to throw away. It was a slender case, about the size of a glasses case, with a few picks and tension wrenches inside, wrapped in a soft cloth. My old boyfriend Danny had given it to me, and I had always kept it at the bottom of a drawer, a relic of another life. I didn't know why I packed it exactly. I told myself it was just sentimental, like the notebook, but some deep, animal part of my brain knew I was walking into a hostile environment and I might need every tool at my disposal. I climbed into their polished SUV, the leather seats smelling of vanilla air freshener, and I watched the old house recede in the side mirror as we pulled away. I was walking into the lion's den, but I needed to be close to observe. I needed to hear the panic in their late-night phone calls, to see the cracks in their gilded facade, to find the documentary evidence that I knew must be somewhere in that house. Their home was a monument to overspending, a 5-bedroom Georgian-style house in a gated community where the lawns were chemically perfect and the mailboxes were all identical brushed nickel. The inside was a study in contrasts. A grand foyer with a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystal, a formal living room with white sofas that no one was allowed to sit on, and then, jarringly, a kitchen that had been half renovated and then abandoned. The back wall was stripped down to the studs, with exposed wiring and a tangle of disconnected plumbing. The floor was a patchwork of subfloor and the edges of the old linoleum. A stack of Italian marble tiles sat in the garage, still in their crates, gathering dust. Vanessa complained about the contractor, about delays, about cash flow timing, her voice tight with a stress she couldn't quite hide. I noticed a pile of unopened envelopes on the kitchen island, many of them with window panes that showed the logos of credit card companies. the red past due stamps visible even from across the room. One day, when Vanessa was on the phone in the other room, I glanced at the pile and saw an envelope from Cascade Hard Money Lending with the words Notice of Default partially visible through the cellophane window. I didn't touch it, but my brain filed it away. I heard Alan on his cell phone, pacing in the hallway late at night, his voice low and urgent, saying things like, "I can get you the payment by Friday, just don't file anything yet, please, I'm begging you. And look, the practice's accounts receivable are very strong, it's just a temporary liquidity crunch. The insurance reimbursements are just slow this quarter." These were not the words of a solvent professional. These were the words of a man frantically bailing water out of a sinking boat. I kept my head down. I offered to help around the house, doing dishes, watering the wilting plants, folding laundry, just to seem harmless and useful and invisible. I paid careful attention to their schedules. Alan left for his clinic at 7:30 each morning, returning late in the evening, sometimes after 9. Vanessa had real estate showings throughout the day, often leaving at 10 and not coming back until mid-afternoon. I was alone in that vast, echoing house for long stretches, and that time became my most precious resource. I used it to think, to plan, and eventually to search. About a week into my stay, a small household disaster gave me my first major break. I was in the guest bathroom on the second floor, washing my face in the sink, when I heard a sharp crack followed by the sudden hiss of spraying water. A pipe under the vanity, an old galvanized steel pipe that had probably been corroding for decades, had burst. Water was jetting out, soaking the cabinet interior and starting to pool on the tile floor. I dropped to my knees, yanked open the cabinet doors, and tried to turn the shut-off valve under the sink. The valve was completely seized, the metal corroded into a solid lump. I ran to the basement, a dark, cobwebby space I had never been in before, my socks getting wet and cold on the concrete floor, and after some searching I found the main water shut-off valve near the water heater, a big brass wheel covered in dust. I cranked it closed with both hands, cutting off water to the whole house. The spraying stopped, leaving behind a wet, dripping silence. I went back upstairs to clean up the mess, mopping up the water with towels, and I realized I needed to pull off the vanity's toe kick panel to sop up the water that had seeped underneath. I kneeled down, pried off the thin wooden panel with a butter knife I borrowed from the kitchen, and reached into the dark, damp space behind the vanity. My fingers brushed against something plastic. I pulled it out. It was a clear plastic kitchen garbage bag, the kind with a drawstring, and it was full of shredded paper. The shreds were not the cross-cut confetti of a proper office shredder. They were long, vertical strips, the product of a cheap home shredder, the kind that cuts paper into ribbons rather than tiny pieces. Many of the strips were still perfectly legible. I sat down on the wet bathroom floor, my heart hammering, and I started pulling out handfuls of shreds, spreading them on the tiles, and piecing them together like the world's most horrifying jigsaw puzzle. My training kicked in automatically. I laid out a bath towel first to create a dry workspace, then began grouping strips by color and font. The paper was slightly damp, but the ink hadn't smeared. They were copies of cleared checks from the custodial account at First Regional Bank. About 20 of them, maybe more, though I later pieced together nearly 30. Each check was drawn on the account of Robert Bryce, Custodial Care Fund, co-trustee Margaret Bryce. The payee was always Bryce Neurology Associates, PLLC, my brother's practice. The memo lines listed medical procedure codes and dates, written in Alan's handwriting. CPT 99205, home visit 3/15. CPT 90791, diagnostic interview 4/2. CPT 95910, nerve conduction study, home setting 5/8. CPT 99214, follow-up visit 5/22. The amounts were staggering: $3,000, $2,500, $4,200, $8,000 on one check for a combination of services. I added the ones I could piece together in my head as I worked, and I stopped counting when I passed $180,000. There were more strips I hadn't even touched yet. I felt a cold wave of nausea wash over me, and I had to put my head down for a moment and breathe. I knew those CPT codes intimately. They were burned into my brain from decades of auditing. CPT 99205 is a Level 5 new patient evaluation and management code. the highest complexity level you can bill for an office or other outpatient visit. It requires a comprehensive history, a comprehensive examination, and medical decision-making of high complexity. It typically takes at least 60 minutes of face-to-face time with the patient. It is almost never billed more than once per patient per physician, because after the first comprehensive evaluation, subsequent visits should be billed at lower codes. Yet here it was, billed monthly for my father, supposedly delivered as a home visit, while he was a resident in a care facility that had its own contracted medical staff. CPT 90791 is a psychiatric diagnostic interview examination, which neurologists sometimes use when they believe there is a psychological component to a patient's condition. Again, multiple times, far beyond any plausible clinical need. And CPT 95910, nerve conduction study, that one made my blood run cold. A nerve conduction study is a procedure that requires specialized electromyography equipment, surface electrodes, a trained technician, and it's performed in a dedicated lab setting with the patient lying on a table while electrical impulses are delivered to the nerves. Billing that code for a home visit in a residential care facility is not just improper. It is medically impossible without a portable EMG machine and a support staff that no private neurology practice keeps lying around. This was not sloppy billing. This was not an innocent mistake or a misunderstanding of coding guidelines. This was systematic, deliberate, carefully planned fraud. I sat on that bathroom floor for what felt like hours, my jeans soaking up the residual water, my hands trembling as I laid out strip after strip, piecing together the picture. My brain was cataloging the anomalies almost automatically. The dates on the checks overlapped in ways that made no clinical sense. No patient, especially an elderly man with advanced dementia, receives a level 5 new patient evaluation every month. The units of service per visit exceeded any plausible schedule. The home address listed on some of the check memos was the care facility's address, but I knew from my conversations with the staff that the facility did not allow outside physicians to bill separately for routine visits and had its own contracted medical director. The whole scheme reeked of phantom billing, the practice of creating records for services that never occurred, and then submitting claims or, in this case, writing checks directly from a custodial account to pay for them. Every single cent had come out of an account that was supposed to be protected by my co-ownership, my oversight, my vigilance. And I had missed it completely. The question that burned in my mind was, how had Alan been able to access the account and write these checks without my signature? As co-owner and trustee, any significant withdrawal should have required my authorization. I had never signed a single one of those checks. I had never even seen them. I carefully gathered all the shreds, placed them into a large Ziploc bag I took from the kitchen drawer, sealed it, and stashed it in the bottom of my suitcase under a pile of sweaters. Then I went to my laptop, connected to the guest Wi-Fi, and logged into the online banking portal for my father's account, using credentials I had set up years ago and that Alan, in his arrogance, had never bothered to change. The account history was still there, but there were large gaps where transaction details had been hidden or reclassified under a subledger labeled POA Managed Activity. I could see the matching debit amounts, large round numbers that corresponded to the checks I had found, but the payee details were summarized, not detailed. The line items just said medical services or care management fee. I needed the physical bank statements, the ones that would show the actual check images and the full transaction narratives. That meant I needed to get into Alan's home office, where I knew he kept his financial files. The next step crystallized in my mind with cold clarity. I had to breach that office, and I had to do it without leaving a trace. The office was on the first floor, a former den that Alan had converted into a workspace. It had a heavy wooden door with a brass knob, and I had noticed, during my first few days in the house, that he kept it locked whenever he wasn't inside. I had tested the knob a few times, casually, as if I were just wandering, confirming that it was always turned closed. The lock was a basic quickset interior knob with a keyed cylinder, the kind you can buy at any hardware store for $20. Nothing high security, no deadbolt, no electronic keypad. I had a skill from my younger years that I never talked about, a skill that I had kept in a locked box in my mind alongside the memories of a man named Danny. When I was 23, I dated a locksmith for 3 years. Danny was a gentle, meticulous man with ink-stained fingers and an encyclopedic knowledge of every lock manufactured in North America. He worked out of a tiny shop on Capitol Hill, a place that smelled of metal shavings and oil, and he loved the puzzle of cylinders and shear lines and pin stacks. He taught me the fundamentals of lock picking during long afternoons in his cluttered workshop, explaining the mechanics of pins and shear lines and tension wrenches with the patience of a natural teacher. We would sit at his workbench, and he would hand me a practice lock and a pick, guiding my fingers, teaching me to feel the tiny click of each pin setting. I was never as good as he was, but I learned enough to open most basic residential locks. He gave me a small set of picks in a leather case, a gift he said might come in handy someday. I had not used them in 20 years, but I had kept them, moved them from apartment to apartment, house to house, a strange little talisman of a life I never lived. When I packed my suitcase to move into Alan's house, I slipped that leather case into a rolled-up sock, not consciously planning to use it, but listening to some deep, animal instinct that told me I might need every tool at my disposal. I waited for a Thursday afternoon, a day when Alan had a full schedule of patients at his clinic, including a luncheon presentation to some pharmaceutical reps that he had mentioned at breakfast. And Vanessa had a listing appointment for a lakefront property 2 hours away in Chelan that she had been complaining about for days. The house would be empty for at least 5 hours. I took a long, steadying breath, retrieved the leather case from my sock, and walked downstairs, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood. I knelt in front of the office door, my heart slamming against my ribs with such force that I could feel my pulse in my temples. I pulled out a pair of thin nitrile gloves I had taken from the cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink and put them on, my fingers suddenly clumsy with adrenaline. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, a small L-shaped piece of metal, and applied gentle, steady clockwise pressure, just enough to bind the first pin. With my other hand, I slid the hook pick into the keyway and began feeling for the pins, one by one, lifting them gently until I heard and felt the faint, satisfying click of each pin setting at the shear line. The lock had 5 standard pins, no security pins, no spools or serrations, nothing sophisticated. It took me maybe 90 seconds, 90 agonizing seconds during which every creak of the house settling made me freeze, to set all 5 pins and turn the plug. The bolt retracted with a smooth, quiet click. I opened the door, slipped inside, and locked it behind me from the inside. The office was a large, rectangular room with a bay window that looked out onto the manicured back lawn. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with thick neurology textbooks, practice management binders, and framed medical journal articles with Alan's name highlighted in yellow. His desk was a massive slab of dark wood, and it was covered in a chaotic layer of papers, sticky notes, a high-end computer monitor, and a desk phone with blinking voicemail lights. Against one wall stood 2 tall metal filing cabinets, the kind with heavy drawers and a central locking bar. A shredder sat in the corner, and I noticed with a chill that it was the exact same cheap strip-cut model that had produced the shreds I found behind the vanity. The computer monitor glowed darkly, the tower humming beneath the desk. I didn't know Alan's password, and I wasn't ready to risk triggering any login alerts or leaving a digital footprint, so I focused on the filing cabinets. The top drawer of the first cabinet was unlocked and contained mostly innocuous material, equipment invoices from medical suppliers, insurance panel contracts, a folder of expired liability policies. The bottom drawer was locked. I knelt again, my knees protesting on the hard floor, and used my picks. This time the lock surrendered in under 60 seconds, a simple 3-pin tumbler that barely offered any resistance. I slid the heavy drawer open, and inside, neatly arranged in hanging file folders with color-coded tabs, was the nerve center of Alan's financial life. I pulled out a folder labeled Robert Bryce, Conservatorship. My father's name, typed in bold on a white label. I lifted the folder out, sat cross-legged on the floor with my back against the filing cabinet, and began to go through it page by page. The folder contained the POA documents I already knew about, the durable healthcare and financial powers that Dad had signed on that horrible afternoon. There was a letter from an attorney I didn't recognize, a man named Gerald Peck, formalizing Alan's appointment as financial guardian under the POA. And then, the heart of the fraud. A thick stack of printed authorization forms, each one titled Custodial Account Withdrawal Authorization, bearing what purported to be my signature and my father's signature, each one approving a specific withdrawal from the account for medical services rendered by Bryce Neurology Associates. I held the first form up to the light, my hands shaking, and I examined the signatures. They were clumsy forgeries, the loops and slants all wrong, the pressure inconsistent. I had a genuine copy of my own signature, a document in the folder from years earlier when I had co-signed the original account opening forms. I laid the two side by side. My actual signature has a distinctive upward stroke at the start of the M in Margaret, a little flourish I've done since I was a teenager. The forged signature started with a downward hook instead, a fundamental error that anyone familiar with my handwriting would spot immediately. The cross on the T in Bryce was low, whereas I always cross my T's high, almost at the top of the letter. The forger had clearly practiced, but not well enough. The notary block on each form was stamped and signed by a notary named Gretchen Wilkes, the same woman from Alan's medical office who had sat in the car when the POA was signed. Her commission number was listed, and the stamp seal was crisp and official. The forms attested that the signers, Robert Bryce and Margaret Bryce, had personally appeared before her and provided identification. That was a lie. I had never appeared before her. My father, in his diminished state, could not have meaningfully appeared before anyone. She had stamp-approved forged signatures, and she had done it repeatedly. I counted 12 such forms, each corresponding to a different batch of checks. Behind the authorization forms, I found a spreadsheet that made my stomach clench so hard I thought I might be sick. It was a printed Excel document, titled Home Visit Services, Robert Bryce. The columns listed dates, times, procedure codes, descriptions, billed amounts, and reimbursement status. There were over 100 entries spanning 18 months. I started reading the details, and I realized I could cross-reference the dates with my own memory, my own records, my own photographs. On March 12th, the spreadsheet said Alan performed a comprehensive neurological evaluation, CPT 99,205, at my father's home at 9 in the morning. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my camera roll, and found a photo I had taken that morning of my father sitting in the facility's dining room eating scrambled eggs, a digital timestamp reading 9:07 a.m. The facility's visitor logs, which I had not yet obtained but would later acquire, showed no entry for Alan that day. On June 3rd, the spreadsheet listed a nerve conduction study, CPT 95,910, supposedly done at noon. I had a phone call log showing I spoke with the facility's nurse at 12:15 that day about my father's diaper rash. She had mentioned that she had been with him all morning and that no outside doctors had visited. The spreadsheet was a diary of fraud, each line a little fiction designed to extract money from a dying man's account. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, the total was bolded and highlighted in yellow, $382,650. Almost the entire custodial account, drained down to a few $1,000s in residuals. I stared at that number and I felt something harden inside me, a cold, implacable resolve. There was no going back now. I kept digging. In the back of the same drawer, tucked behind a row of hanging folders, I found a manila envelope with the logo of a company called Cascade Hard Money Lending. Inside were loan documents showing that Alan had borrowed $200,000 against his neurology practice's accounts receivable, at an interest rate of 18%, about 8 months earlier. The loan was in default, with a formal collection notice dated just last week, threatening legal action and acceleration of the full balance. I also found credit card statements, stacks of them, from half a dozen different accounts, held together with a rubber band. The cumulative balance was over $90,000, much of it from luxury retailers, a high-end home theater system, and payments to the now-vanished kitchen contractor. One statement showed a charge for a pair of shoes at a boutique in downtown Bellevue for $1,200, dated the same month that Alan had told me the custodial account was tight but manageable. Alan was financially hemorrhaging from a dozen arterial wounds, and he had been using my father's money as a tourniquet. I documented everything. I was meticulous, methodical, every muscle memory from my auditing days snapping back into place. I laid each page on the floor, one by one, and photographed it with my phone, ensuring the edges were clear, the text legible, the context obvious. I photographed the forged signatures next to the genuine signatures, holding them side by side with my thumb. I photographed the spreadsheet next to the time-stamped photos on my phone, a visual juxtaposition of lies and truth. I photographed the loan documents and the credit card statements. I worked for over an hour, my knees aching on the hardwood, my mind a blur of grief and rage and a strange, clinical satisfaction. When I was done, I replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, closed the filing cabinet, relocked it, and wiped the exterior surfaces and the doorknob with a tissue to remove any glove prints or smudges. I slipped out of the office, relocked the door from the outside with a practiced flick of the tension wrench, removed my gloves, and retreated to my room, where I sat on the bed for a long time, just breathing, watching the afternoon light move across the wall. The evidence was in my hands, but I didn't yet have the full picture of the institutional mechanism, and I didn't yet have the allies I would need to bring this down legally. Now I had evidence of the theft itself, but I needed to understand the institutional mechanism by which Alan had been able to bypass my co-owner rights at the bank, and I needed a path to legal recourse that didn't rely on simply confronting him and giving him time to destroy evidence, fabricate a defense, or flee. The next morning, while Alan was at a dental implant appointment and Vanessa was at a Pilates class, I dressed neatly in a simple blouse and drove to the downtown branch of First Regional Bank. The sky was a flat, overcast gray, and the bank's lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. I brought my driver's license, a certified copy of my father's death certificate, and the account number from my old files. I asked the teller to speak with a compliance officer. She directed me to a small, windowless office in the back, where I met a man named David Hendricks. David was middle-aged, with thinning hair, wire rim glasses, and the weary, slightly stooped posture of someone who has spent 20 years dealing with bank fraud, estate disputes, and the thousand small tragedies of people's financial lives. His desk was covered in orderly stacks of files, and a framed photo of a golden retriever sat next to his computer monitor. I sat down in the visitor's chair, took a deep breath, and told him I was the co-owner of a custodial account that I believed had been systematically drained through fraud. I showed him the photos on my phone, the forged authorization forms, the spreadsheet, my father's notebook with the warning, the images of the check shreds. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I watched his eyes widen almost imperceptibly behind his glasses as he scrolled through the images. He asked me to wait, and he spent nearly an hour on his computer, pulling internal records, transaction logs, correspondence files. The only sound was the clicking of his keyboard and the occasional heavy sigh. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale, and he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. What he had found was infuriating and, in a strange way, a testament to Alan's methodical depravity. Alan had used the durable financial power of attorney, signed by my father in his diminished state, to petition the bank to reclassify the custodial account as a POA-managed account, a status that effectively removed the dual signature requirement I had relied upon. He had submitted a medical certification from his own practice, signed by himself as the treating neurologist, stating that my father was mentally incompetent and incapable of managing his affairs. He had attached a notarized statement, also signed by himself and notarized by Gretchen Wilkes, asserting that the co-trustee, Margaret Bryce, was unreachable and uncooperative, and was refusing to act in the best interest of the principal. The bank's internal procedures at the time had a dangerous loophole. If a POA holder presented a valid medical declaration of incompetence, along with a notarized affidavit that the co-trustee was unavailable or obstructive, the bank could temporarily waive the joint signature requirement to prevent delays in essential care payments. The intent was to protect vulnerable elderly people from bureaucratic gridlock, but the loophole was a gaping wound that Alan had exploited ruthlessly. He had done it not once, but repeatedly, each time attaching a freshly notarized form that purported to be my consent. The bank had never called me to verify. They had accepted the notary stamps at face value, trusting that a licensed physician and his notary were acting in good faith. Each override had been logged in the system, and the cumulative effect was that Alan had free access to write checks from the account, no questions asked, for over a year. David Hendricks looked sick. He said quietly, "This is a very serious breach of our fiduciary controls. You're obligated to self-report to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency if we find evidence of forgery or elder financial abuse. I need to freeze the account immediately, notify our legal department, and initiate a full internal investigation. MS. Bryce, I am so sorry this happened under our watch." I nodded, thanked him, and asked him to document everything, to preserve every record, every internal communication, every override authorization. He promised he would, and he gave me his direct line, his personal cell phone number written on the back of his business card. I left the bank feeling a grim sense of momentum, a machine beginning to turn. Alan was about to discover that his access had been cut off, and once he did, the clock would start ticking on his panic. In the following days, I began building the external case. I reached out to an old colleague from my hospital days, a forensic accountant named Leela Chen, who had worked with our compliance department on several large-scale insurance fraud investigations. Leela was a tiny woman with an enormous brain, the kind of person who could look at 1,000 pages of financial records and spot the single anomalous transaction that unraveled the whole scheme. I called her from a coffee shop, using a burner phone I had purchased with cash, just in case Alan was monitoring anything. I sat in a corner booth, the burner phone on the table, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside it, and I laid out the entire story, the stolen checks, the phantom visits, the forged signatures, the loan documents. Leela listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a long, low whistle and said, "Maggie, this is exactly the kind of case that a state medical board will feast on. If he billed for services not rendered, and those bills were paid from a custodial account you co-owned, you have elder abuse, fiduciary fraud, and potentially state-level insurance fraud even if Medicare wasn't billed directly. But we need to be strategic. Do not confront him. Do not tip your hand. Let me connect you with someone at the Washington Medical Commission." She linked me with a senior investigator named Dr. Harriet Cole, a former neurologist herself, who had left clinical practice to work in medical regulation after witnessing too many colleagues cut ethical corners. Harriet and I spoke at length over a secure video call a few days later, and I immediately felt a sense of relief. She was calm, precise, and radiated a kind of steely moral clarity that made me feel less alone in the nightmare. Her office, visible in the background, had shelves full of medical board case files and a whiteboard covered in timeline diagrams. She explained exactly what the board would need to issue an emergency suspension of Alan's medical license. Clear, convincing evidence that he had falsified medical records, forged signatures, and billed for services not provided, all tied directly to his professional practice. The photos I had taken were good, but she wanted original documents with wet signatures if possible, and she wanted a detailed timeline correlating the fake visits with independent sources of evidence, like the care facility's visitor logs and staff statements. I went to work with a kind of focused intensity I had not felt since my peak auditing years. I called the administrator of the memory care facility, a competent woman named Patricia Okonkwo, and explained, without revealing too many details, that I needed the visitor logs and the daily care notes for my father's entire residency for a family medical review. I phrased it carefully, saying that there were some financial discrepancies regarding his care, and I needed to clarify what services had actually been provided. She was sympathetic, and, after I faxed her a copy of my identification and my father's death certificate, she sent me the complete records in a thick overnight delivery envelope. I sat at the guest room desk and pored over them. The logs showed, line by line, every person who had entered the facility, their time in and time out, and their relationship to the resident. Alan's name did not appear on a single day that corresponded to the dates on his spreadsheet. In fact, he had only visited the facility 4 times in the entire 18-month period, and those visits were brief social calls, not medical appointments. I obtained notarized statements from 2 of the nurses who had been on duty during the alleged home visits, women I had come to know during my daily visits, named Carla and Miriam. I met them at a quiet diner near the facility, bought them coffee, and explained that I was trying to understand some inconsistencies in my father's medical billing. They confirmed in writing, on simple but legally sound affidavit forms that Harriet had provided, that no outside neurologist had examined my father on those dates, and that the facility's own medical director provided all routine neurological assessments. Miriam, a stout woman with kind eyes, said, "Honey, your brother never came to examine your dad. We never saw him with a stethoscope or any equipment. He just showed up sometimes in a suity thing and talked to the front desk for 10 minutes. That testimony was gold. I tracked down the notary, Gretchen Wilkes, which took some effort because she had left Alan's practice and was living in a small apartment in Spokane. I called her, and at first she was defensive, guarded, terrified of legal consequences. Her voice trembled as she insisted she had done nothing wrong. "I just notarized the documents Dr. Bryce gave me," she said. "He said it was routine, that his sister was unavailable, and it was for his father's care." I didn't know it was fraud. I told her, calmly and without accusation, that I understood she had been placed in a difficult position, that Alan Bryce had asked her to notarize documents without the signers present, telling her it was just routine paperwork for an elderly patient. I said that if she cooperated, I could help her work with investigators to receive immunity in exchange for her testimony. She cried then, a ragged, exhausted sob that came through the phone line like a release of years of guilt, and she admitted that she had done it dozens of times, that Alan had pressured her, that she had kept copies of some of the notary journal entries because she had a bad feeling about it. She agreed to provide those copies and to cooperate fully. Harriet arranged for a limited immunity agreement through the state attorney's office, and Gretchen became a key witness. She later told investigators that Alan would bring her stacks of pre-filled forms and tell her, "Just stamp them. I don't have time to explain everyone." She agreed to it verbally. You know how family stuff is. Meanwhile, in the house, the pressure was intensifying. I heard Alan on the phone, his voice rising in panic as he tried to figure out why the custodial account had been frozen. He slammed cabinets, snapped at Vanessa, paced the hallways at 2 a.m, his footsteps heavy and frantic. The half-finished kitchen remained a dusty monument to their unraveling, the exposed wires and bare drywall a physical manifestation of the rot beneath the surface. One evening, I overheard Alan on a call in the garage, his voice cracking. "I don't care what it takes, just extend the deadline by 2 weeks. I'm about to get a lump sum from an estate settlement, I swear to God." I stood in the hallway, holding my breath, and listened. He hung up and punched the side of a metal shelf, the sound ringing through the garage. Vanessa's real estate commissions had dried up, it seemed, because she was home more often, scrolling through her phone with a tight, angry expression, snapping at me for leaving a cup in the sink. I remained the quiet, compliant sister, offering to make tea, asking no questions. I was a ghost in their house, and they had no idea that I was the architect of their collapsing world. But I needed one more piece before I could trigger the final confrontation. I needed to know, with absolute moral certainty, whether there was any scrap of genuine humanity left in my brother. Any residue of the boy who used to protect me from the neighborhood bullies, any trace of the son who had once cried at our mother's funeral, any chance that the fraud was born of desperation and poor judgment rather than pure, sociopathic indifference. I needed to test him, so I staged a moment of maximum vulnerability. It was a Monday morning. I had been in their house for about 3 weeks. I waited until Alan came downstairs, grumbling about the frozen account, his tie askew, his face pinched with stress. I positioned myself in the front hallway, near the entry table where he always grabbed his keys and his briefcase. The floor was hardwood, cold, and I had removed the small runner rug earlier so there would be no cushion. I let out a choked gasp, clutched my chest with both hands, and collapsed onto the floor as convincingly as I could manage. I am not proud of this, but I even held my breath for a moment to make my face go pale and flushed in patches. I lay there, my body contorted, one arm splayed out, and I moaned, "Alan, Alan, please, I think it's a heart attack. I can't breathe, help me." He stopped walking. He looked down at me, his face blank for a fraction of a second. Then his expression shifted into something I will never forget. Pure, unfiltered annoyance, the look of a man who has been delayed by a minor inconvenience. He stepped over my body, one foot on either side of my torso, his shoe brushing against my sleeve, and reached past my head to grab a manila folder that was sitting on the entry table. He said, without a trace of warmth, "I don't have time for this, Maggie. Call an ambulance if you're really sick. I have a meeting with the bank." And he walked out the front door, letting it slam behind him, leaving me on the cold floor. The sound of his car engine starting and pulling out of the driveway came a moment later. A minute later, Vanessa came down the stairs, holding her phone. She glanced at me, rolled her eyes, and said, "You're so dramatic. Get up, the floor is cold." She stepped around me and went into the kitchen without offering a hand, the sound of her heels clicking away. I lay there for a full minute after their footsteps faded, staring up at the ceiling, at the elaborate crown molding and the small water stain in the corner that they couldn't afford to fix. And I felt the last ember of familial love inside me gutter and die. There was nothing left. No ambiguity, no mercy, no hesitation. I was no longer dealing with a brother. I was dealing with a parasite, a man who would step over his own dying sister to grab a piece of paper. I got up slowly, my body stiff from the floor, and I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap. From that moment on, I treated every interaction like enemy surveillance, and I prepared to bring the full weight of every institution I could summon down upon his head. The confrontation came faster than I expected, accelerated by the bank's freeze and the ripple effects it triggered. Alan's hard money loan defaulted fully when his practice's accounts receivable, already strained, were further scrutinized by the lender. He had been counting on using the last $20,000 from the custodial account to make a balloon payment, and when the money didn't come, the lender filed a formal notice of default and initiated collection proceedings. Alan received a certified letter from the Washington Medical Commission stating that a complaint had been filed against his license, though they did not disclose the source or the specifics. He and Vanessa panicked, their carefully constructed facade cracking wide open. I could hear them arguing in their bedroom, voices muffled but sharp, Vanessa's words laced with venom. They cornered me after dinner on a Thursday evening. The three of us were in the formal dining room, under the crystal chandelier, at a table that was too large and too shiny and felt like a stage set. There were dishes of uneaten pasta congealing on the plates. Alan and Vanessa sat on one side, and I sat on the other, a pot of cold tea between us. Alan's face was a mask of strained concern, but underneath it, I could see the raw, desperate calculation in his eyes. "Maggie," he said, his voice artificially soft, "there's been a terrible misunderstanding with Dad's account at the bank. Some kind of clerical error, an internal audit flag. It's a mess. But we can fix it quickly and cleanly. I've had my attorney draft a new document that affirms your consent to the earlier transactions. It's just a formality, really. If you sign it and come with us to the bank tomorrow morning, we can get everything unfrozen and move on. You don't want to get tangled up in a legal mess, do you? It could take months, years even, to sort out. And you've been through so much already." He slid a sheet of paper across the polished table. It was titled Consent and Ratification of Prior Account Activity. The language was dense, but the meaning was unmistakable. By signing, I would state that I had reviewed all the withdrawals from the custodial account and retroactively approved them, effectively absolving Alan of any claim of fraud, unauthorized access, or breach of fiduciary duty. It would be a blanket pardon for every forged check, every phantom visit, every stolen dollar. I looked at the paper, then at my brother's face, and I felt a strange, almost serene calm wash over me. I had been waiting for this moment, and I was ready. "I'll sign it," I said, my voice quiet and compliant. "But I want to do it at the bank in front of the manager, so there's no more clerical errors or misunderstandings. I want everything to be official and witnessed. I'll meet you there tomorrow morning at 10. Does that work?" Alan and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance, a flicker of suspicion, but they had no choice. The account was frozen and they needed my signature to unlock it. They agreed. "Of course, Maggie," Alan said. "That's very sensible. We'll see you there at 10. I left the table, walked calmly to my room, and closed the door. That night I contacted David Hendricks, Harriet Cole, and Detective Marquez, a financial crimes detective I had been put in touch with through Harriet, to confirm the plan. Everything was in motion. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a simple navy blouse and gray slacks, my courtroom clothes, as I thought of them. I had my phone fully charged, a folder with printed copies of all my evidence zipped into a leather portfolio, and a small digital audio recorder in my pocket, running. I arrived at First Regional Bank at 9:45, and David Hendricks met me in the lobby. He escorted me to a private conference room in the back, a windowless space with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. Inside, waiting, were Dr. Harriet Cole of the Medical Commission, Detective Marquez, and a federal agent from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, a woman named Agent Flores who specialized in healthcare fraud. They were all seated along one wall, with notepads and quiet, watchful expressions. There was also a uniformed bank security officer stationed near the door. David had arranged the room so that the authorities were out of direct sightline from the doorway, and a second conference room across the hall had been set up with an audio monitoring feed. The plan was simple: get Alan on record in front of witnesses acknowledging the transactions and attempting to coerce me into signing the ratification document, then trigger the intervention. Alan and Vanessa arrived at exactly 10 a.m., looking polished and brittle. Vanessa wore a charcoal pantsuit and carried a designer briefcase that probably cost more than my car. Alan had his serious doctor face on, his jaw set, a leather portfolio under his arm. They had brought a new notary with them, a nervous young man named Kevin who trailed behind them clutching a stamp. We all took seats around the conference table, David Hendricks at the head, me across from Alan. Alan launched into a rehearsed speech about how the unfortunate confusion had arisen from my father's dementia and Maggie's understandable emotional state during a difficult time. He presented the consent and ratification document, along with a stack of what he called supporting medical records, which were, I could see at a glance, the same internal records I had photographed in his office, dressed up to look official with a cover sheet that said Exhibit A. He pushed a pen across the table toward me. "Just your signature here, Maggie, and then we can all put this behind us. Kevin will notarize it, and we'll be done in 5 minutes." I picked up the pen. I held it for a long, deliberate moment, rolling it between my fingers, letting the silence stretch. Then I set it down gently. I looked directly into Alan's eyes, and I spoke, my voice low and steady. "Alan, I am not going to sign a document that retroactively approves fraud. I have photos of every forged authorization form from your filing cabinet, your spreadsheet of fake home visits, and your own office files that show you drained Dad's custodial account to cover your personal debts. I know about the EMG codes you build for a procedure that cannot be done in a home setting. I know about Gretchen Wilkes and the notary stamps she applied to forgeries. I know about the facility visitor logs that prove you were never there for any of the visits you billed. You stole $382,650 from our dying father, and you forged my name to do it. You are not going to walk away from this." His face went through a rapid, horrifying series of transformations. Shock first, his mouth dropping open. Then a flash of fury, his eyes narrowing to slits, his knuckles whitening on the table. Then a desperate, scrambling attempt to regain control, his hands flattening on the polished wood. "That is absolutely insane," he sputtered, his voice rising. Those were legitimate medical consults. I was managing his complex neurological condition remotely, consulting with the facility staff by phone, reviewing his charts. It's all perfectly billable under the home visit and telehealth codes. You don't understand how modern neurology billing works. You're confused, Maggie. You've been under an enormous amount of strain. This is a family dispute, a misunderstanding, not a criminal matter. David, tell her. I didn't respond. I simply looked toward the door. It opened, and Dr. Harriet Cole stepped into the room, holding a leather folder embossed with the state seal. Behind her came Agent Flores and Detective Marquez, their badges visible. Harriet's voice was calm and devastating. "Doctor, Alan Bryce, I am an investigator with the Washington Medical Commission. You are under investigation for unprofessional conduct, systematic billing fraud, elder financial abuse, and falsification of medical records. We have an emergency summary suspension order for your medical license, effective immediately." She placed the order on the table in front of him, the papers crisp and official. Agent Flores stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on her service weapon. "And Dr. Bryce, you are under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft, pursuant to a federal warrant. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The next few minutes were a blur of shouted denials, Vanessa's shrill, panicked accusations, the metallic click of handcuffs, and the quiet professional efficiency of the officers. Alan's face was red, then pale, the blood draining as the reality of the situation crashed over him. He was led out through the bank's main lobby, past a crowd of stunned customers and tellers, his head ducked low, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Vanessa tried to follow, shouting about lawyers, but Detective Marquez detained her with a calm but firm hand and informed her that she, too, was under investigation for her role in the forgery scheme. She stood in the hallway, her designer briefcase dangling from her hand, her face a mask of disbelief, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I sat in the conference room with David Hendricks, my hands folded on the table, my body trembling slightly but my mind utterly clear. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, and underneath it, a quiet, flickering sense that I had finally, after all these years, kept a promise I made to my father. The aftermath unfolded over many months, a slow grind of legal processes and institutional machinery that I will compress here, though the reality was a marathon of depositions, hearings, and procedural delays. The State Medical Board conducted a comprehensive audit of Alan's entire practice, pulling billing records for all his patients from the previous 5 years. What they found went far beyond my father. Alan had been systematically upcoding office visits, billing for complex procedures that were never performed, and forging attending physician signatures on insurance claims for at least 4 years. He had defrauded Medicare, Medicaid, and a dozen private insurers out of hundreds of thousands of additional dollars, a pattern of behavior that the board's report described as a pervasive culture of dishonesty and financial exploitation. His medical license was summarily suspended pending a full hearing, and when the hearing concluded, the board voted unanimously to permanently revoke his license. He would never practice medicine again, never write a prescription, never set foot in an exam room as a physician. The career he had spent his entire life building was erased. The criminal case moved with surprising speed because the evidence I had gathered was so overwhelming, and Gretchen Wilkes's cooperation sealed the narrative. Alan was indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft for forging my signature, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Facing the prospect of a trial that would expose every detail of his scheme to public scrutiny, and with his own defense attorney bluntly telling him that the evidence was insurmountable, Alan accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of identity theft, and he was sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 3 years of supervised release. As part of the plea, he was required to forfeit all assets derived from the fraud and to pay full restitution to the victims, including me. Vanessa, who had actively participated in creating fake invoices and forged documents, was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony and documents that further incriminated Alan, and she received a sentence of probation with community service and financial penalties. Their marriage, predictably, disintegrated during the proceedings, and the divorce was finalized before Alan even entered prison. The Bellevue house was sold at auction for a fraction of its original value, the proceeds swallowed by liens and legal fees. The civil case was my own quiet, methodical victory. I filed a civil lawsuit against Alan for conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking compensatory damages for the stolen funds, punitive damages for the egregious nature of his conduct, and recovery of my legal fees. With the criminal conviction and the medical board's findings as a backdrop, the case was straightforward. Alan, already drowning in legal bills and stripped of his income, did not mount a meaningful defense. The court awarded me $520,000 in damages, a calculation that included the $382,000 he had stolen, plus interest, plus my extensive legal costs, plus punitive damages intended to send a message about elder financial abuse. To satisfy the judgment, Alan was forced to liquidate everything. He sold his medical practice building, his equipment, his investment accounts, and whatever remained of his personal assets. I received payment over the course of a year, a steady stream of deposited funds that did not feel like a windfall or a victory lap. It felt like a return of something that had been violently taken, a restoration of a promise my father had made to protect his future. I did not keep all the money. I used a significant portion of it to establish a small nonprofit organization called the Caregivers Shield Project, which educates elderly people and their families about how to protect their assets from predatory guardians, fraudulent powers of attorney, and the specific financial scams that target individuals with dementia. I wrote a comprehensive guidebook, The Caregiver's Shield, a practical guide to financial protection in the age of elder fraud, which I distribute for free through senior centers, legal aid clinics, and memory care facilities across the state. I also volunteer as a pro bono consultant for the Washington State Adult Protective Services Division, helping their investigators spot the financial red flags that I once missed, the subtle billing anomalies, the forged signatures, the quiet weaponization of trust. I train social workers and bank compliance officers on how to recognize the patterns of elder financial abuse before it is too late. My father's name is on the cover of every guidebook, and I like to think that in some small way, his legacy now protects others. My father's black laboratory notebook sits on a shelf in my living room now, in a small shadow box next to his photograph. The photograph shows him in his classroom, wearing a polka-dotted bow tie, holding up a beaker of something bright blue, grinning at the camera. The notebook is open to the last page, the warning preserved under UV blocking glass, the shaky handwriting a permanent reminder of the moment my father, even as his mind was fracturing, reached across the darkness to save me. He knew. He saw what I could not see, and he did what he could with the time he had left. He left a message in a bottle, and I found it, and I carried it through the fire. Looking back, I understand that the betrayal was not just the money. It was the years of performing the role of a devoted, caring son while systematically dismantling our father's legacy for his own greed. It was the way he weaponized the very bonds of family, the trust that should be sacred, and twisted them into a tool of exploitation. It was the casual cruelty of stepping over me on the floor, the indifference to my suffering, the assumption that I was too weak and too foolish to ever fight back. But I also learned that competence is its own kind of armor, and that a life spent in quiet, meticulous work can prepare you for battles you never imagined you would face. The skills I had built over 2 decades, the ability to read a financial statement, to spot a fraudulent CPT code, to piece together shredded documents on a bathroom floor, to pick a lock when necessary, those skills are what allowed me to stand up against a predator who had every institutional advantage. And I learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone overlooks, the invisible daughter, the quiet sister, the woman with the spreadsheet, and the unwavering attention to detail. So here is what I hope you take away from my story. Trust is not a gift. It is a currency that, once counterfeited, can never be earned back, no matter how much you beg or borrow or promise. Family means absolutely nothing without integrity, and the title of brother or son or father does not grant immunity for cruelty. If you ever find yourself staring at a warning written in a dying parent's hand, a quiet cry for help left in a drawer or a notebook or a voicemail, do not rationalize it away. Believe it, investigate it, fight for it, because the people who prey on the vulnerable count on your silence, your doubt, your exhaustion. They count on you being too tired to fight. Prove them wrong. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments below. I want to hear your stories, and I read every single one. And if you believe in protecting the vulnerable from those who claim to care for them, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories of justice served, the slow, meticulous, relentless kind that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. I'm Maggie Bryce, and this is my story. Thank you for watching.